everyone, to another episode of the Hector and Mike Experience: Common Sense in an Uncommon World. And Mike, this week just got a lot crazier with the elections. Everyone's starting to gear up. Everyone's kind of working right now. We've got a primary election, at least in California and in many other places. Super Tuesday, that's happening in March. Things are kind of moved up. You've got a lot of other states that have primaries that are even closer than that. But I think the big news the big news is dominating most of the press right now is the Colorado Supreme Court and their decision to knock Donald Trump off of their primary off of the ballot. What the hell's going
Well,
on, Mike? I know you've been in conference calls, you've been in discussions regarding this. So, what is going on?
yeah, well, remember, Colorado was the first state to legalize marijuana, so you start there, and then it all might make sense. Well, the Supreme Court in Colorado apparently has a very unique interpretation, and it was a 4-3 decision, by the way. But they have a unique interpretation of an insurrection, and so their argument is that because of what happened on January 6th, they considered that the president participating in a quote unquote insurrection, and according to the Constitution, that would disqualify him from being on the ballot. So it was, as I think, well put by the state Supreme Court justice, as what the Colorado Supreme Court did was it was a 4-3 decision, and what the majority said was that by his participation in the January 6th events that occurred, they considered that an insurrection. And as a result of that, according to the Constitution, that he is not eligible to run for president. What's interesting is that there's to say a reach is probably a polite word for it in their decision, because even the head of the Colorado State Supreme Court, who was in the minority opinion, wrote that it was an overreach in what they were doing in determining what is the definition of an insurrection, as well as defining his role if it was an insurrection. So it's an extraordinarily weak case. What it does do is it will encourage other states to continue to try their efforts. I know Minnesota tried and failed. A couple of other states tried and failed to have him removed from the ballot. I mean, the actual effect of it is there will be an appeal. I would imagine it'll be I'm not a predictor of the courts. Brady is a predictor of the courts. But I think what will happen is that it will be, obviously it will be appealed to the Supreme Court, and I think the Supreme Court will overturn the Colorado decision. That's the legal part of it. The practical, political part of it is that it's Christmas in Trump world. The ability to raise money off of this, through the roof, at least a couple of million. A lot of that in small dollar donors. So big windfall there. Big windfall in terms of dominating what the message is. Big windfall in terms of, you see all of the other candidates kind of coalescing, saying it's the wrong thing to do. And by the way, I think everybody is right in that sense. If the voters don't want Donald Trump to be president, then they should vote to not have Donald Trump be president. It's that simple. It should not be a court that decides that, especially since all that's happened so far has been indictments, no trials, no convictions.
Well, let's go into that, Mike, because I know, and we've talked about this before, but for anyone who's kind of listening to this for the first time, there's a difference. An indictment, right? It sounds so damning when you say someone's been indicted. It seems as though
Right.
they've already been found guilty of something, but in reality, an indictment is just an accusation. It's an accusation that has been made, and it is an accusation that has only been brought forth by just one side, which is
Right.
the prosecution, and that's it. The defense isn't in the room. They're not allowed to cross-examine. They're not allowed to even question any of the information they brought forth. And I know you've sat in a grand jury.
Hmm.
So I mean, what is an indictment for these people for people listening and watching this?
It's exactly what you said. It is not, and you know, first of all, there's the constitutional thing: a person is innocent until proven guilty. Okay, now there's guilty in terms of the law, and there's guilty in terms of the court of public opinion. But an indictment itself is where the prosecution, usually a federal or state entity, court, law enforcement agency, comes forward and provides an accusation with some facts related to it that people sitting on a grand jury have to decide by a margin, not unanimous, not even close to unanimous. Um, have to decide, like, there's 22 people on a grand jury, and I think it's 16 have to approve to indict. It is a one-sided presentation. Things like, you know, you would ordinarily ask, or in the course of a jury trial, like, how did you acquire that evidence, or what makes you say that, what makes you think that, what evidence do you have? None of that comes into play. It is simply a presentation of, here's what the law says, here's what we think happened, um, and whether that evidence was acquired legally, illegally, none of that matters in terms of your vote. That is irrelevant to what your job is as a grand juror. That is up to an actual jury that happens during the course of a trial. So the common phrase is that you can indict a ham sandwich.
Yeah.
Um, and so, you know, that's kind of the way they do it. As it relates to Colorado, again, number one, they assume that what that legally, again, we're not talking public perception. They're making the assumption that legally what happened was January 6th. Okay. Now, first of all, there's a legal standard that has to be met to define it as an insurrection, not a public opinion thing. You know, people have different opinions of it, but a legal standard that has to be met. That's number one. Number two, somehow they have to prove that the president participated in this insurrection. And, you know, really, with what the evidence has been presented, is that, you know, they're saying that his speech on January 6th is what created the insurrection, that they have not proven legally existed. So again, I go back to the premise of, what you have here is a political court, you know, because remember, a lot of these state Supreme Courts, I mean, we know it here in California, you know, I know back home in Rhode Island and other places, these are people that are appointed by governors for the most part. I don't know of states that have election. Well, yeah, they do. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania have elections for state Supreme Court, but many states, they're chosen by the governors. Um, so this is a political body, that has come forward and said this. And again, I don't know legally. Um, I don't know how it's going to stand up. I don't think it is going to stand up. I just know right now, today in December of 2023, less than a month before the Iowa primaries, a month away from the New Hampshire, I mean, the Iowa caucuses, a month away from the primary in New Hampshire, and 2 months ahead of, well, 3 months ahead of the Super Tuesday primaries, this now takes over the conversation. And that does nothing but help Donald Trump. That does nothing but help him raise money. Does nothing but help him become another victim of weaponization of government, this time at the state level. And it does nothing but hurt someone like Nikki Haley, who is kind of picking up a little momentum, in terms of people paying attention to her. Now it all shifts to this thing and the argument to it. It really is government interference in the political process.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in this particular situation, it's not like Donald Trump had an opportunity to go and testify, right?
No, of
Or
course not.
or get or hold or be on the
No
stand,
one.
or
No,
or
no
be
one.
or even his own side to say, hey, here's the evidence we're presenting to you showing that we weren't involved, or we weren't, we shouldn't be found guilty of this. There was no trial held. on
Right.
this. It was basically the Supreme Court just saying, okay, well, based on the information we've seen, based on what we've read, this amounts to it,
Right.
as opposed to holding some sort of trial to find guilt or innocence on it.
Right. That's absolutely correct. He would not have, and none of his battery of lawyers would have. No one from the White House would have. No one even who is, probably going to testify in the Georgia case would have. It's simply a case of them looking and saying, based on what we saw on January 6th, we believe that raised to a level of insurrection. Based on what we saw in his speech, that involved him in the insurrection. And because the law states that if you're involved in an insurrection, you're not qualified to run for president, we're drawing the conclusion that he shouldn't be on the ballot.
I
I
mean,
mean, like I
it's like,
said,
okay,
go ahead.
and it's crazy. I mean, if you go into these minority, I mean, that's a fear of most minorities out there. It's like, I look a certain way, I'm wearing a hoodie, I'm walking down a certain street, I must be guilty of something. And
Hmm.
and I know, and this is kind of it's tangential to it, where it's you, because of a certain speech he made, because of what I've read, because things seem to have aligned, all of a sudden he's guilty on it. And look, and we've been very critical of Donald Trump in this particular in our particular podcast, in our discussions here. We've talked about other candidates, but I mean, this is just absurdity in it.
It,
I mean, how the ACLU or all these other groups that are out there trying to defend minorities, trying to defend other folks that get accused of something, and yet all of a sudden are deemed as though they're guilty of something without even going to trial. I mean, these are the fights that all these groups do on bail. They say, look, you've been accused of something, you haven't been convicted of it, so why do you even have bail, set on you, which comes with the cost? Their argument is they should just be let free until they are found guilty or there is enough evidence being presented that there is some sort of guilt toward it. And so yet all that particular group is silent on it, but they're in favor of what's happening here. And it seems contradictory. And at the same time, I mean, you're right, Mike. This is lending a lot of fuel over not just to Donald Trump and his fundraising, but I think it's also lending a lot of fuel over to minority groups that we're seeing more Hispanics taking the side of Donald Trump and saying, yeah, I don't think that this is fair what's happening, because if we've seen it happen in our minority communities, and now it's
right.
happening to this guy, and this guy's rich.
Right. Well, that's part of his argument, by the way, is this weaponization of government to use it to advance an agenda. And in this case, the agenda is to not have him on the ballot. Is something, if they're going to do that to someone who's got an unlimited bank account and all of the lawyers you could ever want, what the hell chance do you have? Especially if you're a minority. What chance do you, if they can do that to him, what chance do you have as a minority? I mean, that is absolutely one of his arguments in this, is that, yeah, they're targeting him. There's no doubt about that. And, there's cases that are pending that will go to trial, and that's the way it should be.
Right.
But what the point is, on something like this, they're presuming guilt. The court is presuming guilt. The court is presuming evidence that shows that this was an insurrection according to the law. They're assuming that he participated in this insurrection, again, according to the law, not public opinion. And, as a result, they've decided, okay, he's off the ballot. I mean, if they can railroad somebody like that, who has the money, the clout, the power, the name, and everything else that Donald Trump has, what chance do you, as an ordinary person without the bank account, without the connections, without the lawyer, what chance do you have? And that's part of his communication strategy, is to paint that picture, because it connects him, as crazy as it sounds, it connects him with folks like that, because now if they can go after him, they can go after them.
Yeah, it's a working class folks, but it also goes into, and maybe this is going a little too far in it, but which, I mean, shit, if you and I are running for office and I don't like you, and I happen to be higher up in office, and my buddy's the attorney general, can they bring something to go indict you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And, that, and is
Well,
that
and
not, and is that,
I'm from Rhode Island. If you do that, I gain 5 points in the polls. It's like, oh, so I mean, you got to keep this in perspective here. Uh, it's like, oh, he's okay. He got indicted. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it becomes a political tactic, the same way you
it's a
use direct
weaponization, right?
mail. Right. It's a political tactic that gets used, and the courts are supposed to be above that. And that's why you look at it and you say, what Colorado, what the Supreme Court, the four justices in Colorado did was completely, in a world where it is upside down, they've completely gone off the deep end because it is just such a reach and such a stretch that, I don't see any way it holds up. All it does is it interferes with the political process.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, and from, I think what aggravates people too, by the way, is that we're not talking about you and me now. We're not talking about the guy that goes and pays $5 plus for gas. We're not talking about the people that have to work 3 jobs to pay their rent. We're not talking about the fact that a young couple gets married and can't afford a house because of the interest rates. We're not talking about the cost of goods coming in or the trade imbalance that we have with China. We're not talking about open borders. We're talking about a rich guy who's getting hosed by a Supreme Court from Colorado, and there are other things for us that are more important that we want to hear our candidates talk about. And so I think that's another frustration that people have. It's pretty transparent what's happening, and I think people will react badly to it.
Yeah. So what happens next? Is does it go to the Supreme Court automatically, or do they have to petition? What's the next steps?
I think the next step is that the campaign will file to have it taken up by the Supreme Court. I think what happens legally in the system, not being a lawyer, not staying at a Holiday Inn last night, but I think legally, like each Supreme Court judge has a particular region that they oversee for cases that come up before it gets to the Supreme Court. So whoever's in that particular area of Colorado on the Supreme Court would then have a hearing and then make a recommendation whether or not it should be taken up by the full court. And my guess is that probably will get filed sometime in January. And it'll be another thing to add into the equation. It's interesting, if I could just digress for a second. The other side, the Democrats don't learn. That's what's fascinating to me. In 2016, when Donald Trump was running, and this was before he had taken hold. I mean, this is actually 2015 when this happened. There was, and I know this because someone was there was this kind of get together in the Hamptons in New York of some of the, what I would call elite in the media, publications, broadcasts, what have you, with a determined effort to try and discredit him and go after him on every single thing in every single case, to build up all of this stuff so that he had no chance of winning. And it completely blew up in their face because they failed to recognize that he had an ability to get past them and communicate directly with people. That still exists. And so all of these efforts that they try and do on this really just backfires in their face. And if they were smart, they would just leave it alone. Let the people decide. If the Republican primary voters don't want Donald Trump to be their nominee, they'll vote for Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis or Chris Christie or Vivek. My guess is that that's not going to happen. If the voters of this country don't want Donald Trump to be president, they'll vote for somebody else. And so you let the voters decide. You don't try and put your thumb or your finger on the scale of justice to try and create an imbalance there. When you do, it backfires and bites you in the butt. And that's what they should have learned in 2016, but I don't think they have.
Yeah, no, it's gonna be fascinating, and so, here are the offices. There's a lot of folks who are working on campaigns, and I mean, and that's all they're focused on right now is a campaign work. I mean, they've got Senate races, they've got congressional races, and state races, but it's up and running right now for for all these folks. I mean, the ads are out there in the primary, in the early states, and so I mean, come January, this thing goes into overdrive, and I mean, it's crazy that they would do this. It's politicizing, the election itself from the court, which is supposed to be, I mean, that's supposed to be the absolutely non-political branch of our office
Right.
of branches of government, and to do this, and you're right, they're going to supercharge his fundraising, and he goes out once again, and he becomes the victim. He
And
becomes
that, I
the
mean, it's,
martyr. He becomes the victim again
yeah.
of a government that is so big that anyone who questions it, they are going to succumb. They're going to try to succumb. Push you down, and it's that message he had before, and it's this message he's going to carry on right now, and
And it works.
it's
And it
banana.
works.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the, I mean, people forget the last election, and that's one of the things people need to remember, as we go through this process and we talk about Joe Biden and his numbers and everything else. Things change quickly in an election. I mean,
yeah,
in January of 2020, Donald Trump was not only going to win, he was going to win in a landslide. I mean, that's what all the polling showed. And the reason for that was interest rates were below 2%, gas prices were a couple of bucks, energy prices for your fuel oil to heat your home was down. We were energy independent. We were selling our energy to other countries instead of importing it. You went to the market and you didn't have to find your bag of chicken or your bag of steak wrapped in a little tag so somebody didn't steal it. When somebody went into a Nordstrom's and stole stuff, they were arrested and prosecuted. I mean, all of that. And that's why he was so popular and we're heading to a landslide victory before COVID hit.
yeah,
So anything can change the trajectory pretty quickly. And so that's probably going to happen a couple of times along the way. But right now, all this court has done really is solidified the president's message about him being a victim, and it has supercharged his fundraising, and it has thrown the other candidates off their message because they now have to come to defend him.
right.
I mean, you've got Haley, you've got Chris Christie, who can't stand the guy defending him. You got Vivek saying, hey, I'm going to take my name off the ballot in Colorado, and I mean, I think personally, if a moose was running against Vivek in Colorado, the moose would win. But so but that's just me. So I mean, it's now all about him again,
Yeah,
and and the beat goes on.
yeah. Well, we'll see in January what whether the Supreme Court ends up taking this case. Which it's I mean, everything we read, it's showing that they are, I mean, they can't, it's hard to ignore this. um, it's hard to ignore, it would be hard for them to ignore this thing and keep him off the ballot. But if he's kept off the ballot in Colorado, what does that mean overall? I mean, let's say he wins all 49 other states or 47 other states, what does that mean? It's just
Well, what it practical you want the political or the practical?
the practical first.
Well, the practical is that the Yucca Mountain nuclear waste site in Nevada will now be moved to Denver, Colorado.
Yes.
That's the practical. The political is that he's not going to, chances of him, if he's winning Colorado in 2024, then he's at 350 electoral votes. I mean,
Yeah.
Colorado is not a purple state anymore; it's a blue state. And so, if he's winning in Colorado, if he were to be looking at winning in Colorado, then the map is going to be heavily red. I think from a practical standpoint, that's probably not going to happen. But the question would be, you'll have more lawsuits because people who are running on the ballot, especially on the Republican side of the ballot, you don't have a nominee for president. That's going to impact the ballot. So
That's true.
they would have a legal argument to say, your decision is impeding my ability to have a fair election running for governor or senate or even state legislature
Right.
because the top of my ticket is blank because of this court intervention. And so they would probably then file a lawsuit, I would think, to say that they're being harmed by the decision that this court is making. They may do that. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and I wear a Santa hat, but they may decide to do that in terms of all of the things that are filed with the Supreme Court when it gets there, which is to say, doing this to him, taking him off the ballot, has this impact on other people that takes away their rights to have a
Right.
fair election.
So if he's
So
taking off the ballot in the primary, he can't be on the ballot in the general then.
no, it would be off the ballot completely. He'd
Yeah.
be off the ballot completely, and that would have a residual impact, because the argument is not so much the primary. The argument is because of, again, their interpretation of a legal insurrection, their interpretation of him contributing to that illegal insurrection disqualifies him from being a candidate.
Yeah.
Period. End of story. Whether it's the primary or the general.
Yeah. It's absurd. But we'll find out what happens with the Supreme Court, and what their decision is, not to take on the case, and at the same time, whether they try to expedite this, because they're gonna have to move, because the ballots are gonna have to get printed pretty soon.
And Colorado's an all-male state, so um, you know, basically it's kind of like like California. They've been doing it longer than California has, where they send out ballots to everybody. So yeah, they're gonna have to. They're gonna have. I would assume it would be expedited because again, other states will be looking at this. I'm sure New York will be looking at it. Illinois will be
California's looking at it. Yeah.
California's looking at it. Um, again, any of those states, if he's playing in 2024, then the election is over. He's won. But I would think places like Michigan, which has actually Michigan, the court there just ruled that he does get on the ballot.
Okay.
But I think a place like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which have two very liberal and very activist Supreme Courts, would probably be two places that I would be concerned that are battleground states that he would have to fight for.
Okay. Well, we'll see what happens with it, Mike. Thanks on this thing. So.
Merry Christmas.